Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here and it's Tuesday, which means we are doing our meta deck tier list for this new format. The first week, I guess, or I guess going into the second week. I don't necessarily know or remember when the set came out, but this is our first tier list of the new Extra Dimensional Crisis format. Now, to be honest with you, some decks are still remaining from previous formats, but a lot of the best decks in the game right now are actually utilizing Pokemon from this new mini set. So basically, I think we've got about 23 different decks, different archetypes in this particular video. These are the most played or the most relevant archetypes in the metagame right now, at least in the first week or so. So we're gonna go ahead and rank them. This is gonna be both sort of a tournament and ranked battles tier list. We'll talk about kind of the strengths and weaknesses of all of these decks in both different scenarios. However, I think that a lot translates between the two. So this is more just a general tier list of how I think decks are well positioned in the format right now in the current metagame. All right, guys, let's just sort of dive right into it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay tuned, and yeah, we got a bunch more content coming on the channel in the next coming days. So you're going to want to stay tuned for that. Now, one thing I will say is that, some people might be curious why some decks aren't on this tier list. Realistically, we can't put a million decks on the tier list. So if it's not really seeing common play either in high, ranked battle tiers like an Ultra Ball or in Master Ball, or if it's not seeing play in tournaments, it just didn't make the tier list. I'm sure next week there's going to be different decks and things like that. But for now, these are, I think, 22 or 23 decks that are kind of the most relevant decks, at least right now, in the current format. All right, let's do it, guys. Let's dive right in. These videos typically take a while, so you guys can kind of feel free to comment below about how long the video is and how much I talked. In the same vein, comment down below and let me know what you guys think of the placements here. Where do you think I went wrong? Where do you think I went right? I would love to hear your guys' opinions. Okay, now let's start off with Buzzwole. In fact, I believe actually all of these, images, or I guess decks, are in like alphabetical order, depending on how I named the image files when I created them. But anyway, let's just start off with Buzzwole. And a couple different Buzzwole decks. I have broken it out into two different categories because I do believe that both of the two Buzzwole archetypes do kind of function a little bit differently. It's kind of a spectrum. I think that Buzzwole and Celesteela are the two cards that are going to be in every deck, and then whether or not you're playing Pheromosa, and maybe you're pairing it with maybe a couple copies of Cyrus, or maybe you're playing Kartana, maybe you're playing some Hand Disruption. Again, there's some fluidity in the way that we're building Buzzwole decks, but I am going to split it up into really just two kind of categories. And that is Buzzwole decks that are playing two copies of Pheromosa and maybe one Kartana, maybe zero Kartana. And then we have Buzzwole decks that are playing two Kartana, maybe one Pheromosa, maybe one, or maybe none. So that's sort of the, I guess, how we're splitting up the Buzzwole archetypes. First off, let's talk about Buzzwole and Pheromosa, which is technically the most common way that people are playing Buzzwole. And it is actually the second most played archetype in Pokemon Pocket right now. I think if you combine both Pheromosa and Kartana versions of Buzzwole, it might end up being like Buzzwole in general might be the most played deck of the format. If not, it's like very closely tied for second or right next to, Rampardos Silvally. Anyway, Buzzwole Pheromosa, I think is really good. I think in a vacuum, Buzzwole Pheromosa with multiple copies of Cyrus is actually probably the strongest deck in the game, but definitely one of them. In my mind, it is in general the best way to play Buzzwole. I just think that it's really strong being able to target Pokemon. The 20 damage that you're doing with Pheromosa, both to the active and the bench, does open up KOs for Buzzwole. Cyrus is a win condition. The only downside to this deck is that a lot of different decks in the format are playing healing cards. It's just a pretty common thing, whether it's Solgaleo or Charizard or any of those stage 2 decks that are playing Lele, or you're playing against Giratina Darkrai, which is playing, of course, Giant Capes. Giant Capes very common in the format as well. Or they're playing, of course, Pokemon Center Ladies. So all that is pretty common. One thing I will say about Buzzwole is that I think that it is, in general, the best archetype in the game. They kind of gave it everything. I just feel like Grass right now is extremely strong. Not only hitting for weakness against Rampardos, which is one of course, the best Pokemon in the game, but we're hitting for weakness all of the new Dark-type Pokemon like Guzzlord, and then, of course, we're also hitting for weakness on Darkrai, which is still seeing a lot of play. So the 120 damage from Buzzwole doesn't really feel like 120, especially, when we're pairing it with Pheromosa, with Kartana, and, of course, we're hitting for weakness on so many good Pokemon. I think that Buzzwole just kind of has everything going for it. Basically, it's got two key factors in this particular deck that I think are extremely broken in Pokemon Pocket. Like, there's no way to kind of describe how good it is, other than like the two things that this deck can do, of course, with Celesteela, is that you can kind of move your Pokemon once or sometimes twice in one turn, however you want, without actually discarding energies, and that's absolutely broken. So basically, it's like free retreat, but we're just going to call it a pivot because you're not actually retreating. It doesn't cost anything, and you can do it more than once. So that particular mechanic, Celesteela, is absolutely incredible. Of course, that's not exclusive to Buzzwole, but of course, course, you are going to be playing 2 Celesteela in every Buzzwole deck. It basically allows Celesteela to be sort of like a frontline, just sort of a tank Pokemon, like a wall to just sort of soak up damage. It can live a hit from Silvally. And then we have Pheromosa and Kartana, which are really strong, fast-paced, low-energy, single-prize attackers that kind of set up Buzzwole. And you can mix and match between the two at any point in time. With Celesteela, you could also potentially just do 100 damage with Celesteela. It's kind of crazy. So the free pivoting is absolutely broken, but also all of the Ultra Beasts also get Lusamine, which is basically energy conservation or energy acceleration, depending on, what stage in the game it is. You can play 2 copies of it, and technically you can just sort of bring back a total of 4 energies throughout the course of a game, which is, again, absolutely broken. Energy is the main, I guess, resource in Pokemon Pocket. So all of these things kind of go in place for Buzzwole, either of the Buzzwole decks, and I think, of course, with Erica's, with Leaf Cape, Buzzwole just has kind of everything going for it. It's got 140 HP with Leaf Cape, that's 170. You have Erica's. It's just an insane deck. It really is absolutely phenomenal. I like Buzzwole Pheromosa, but again, against the field right now, it doesn't feel as strong as Kartana personally. And the one thing I will say is that Buzzwole Pheromosa does actually lose, I think, in the head-to-head matchup most of the time to Kartana. Just because Kartana can 2-hit KO Pheromosa, but Pheromosa has to attack 3 times to KO Kartana, theoretically does give you an advantage. Plus, of course, in the mirror matchup, they're also playing Leaf Cape and they're also playing Erica, so just doing 40 damage to maybe whatever active Pokemon is just technically, I think, a little bit better. Kartana can take KOs in a little bit more scenarios, and like I said, Pheromosa is a little bit easier negated by a bunch of the healing cards, which are in the format right now. Against some of the Stage 2 decks, I think Kartana is also better. A couple attacks with the Kartana does sort of set up really any kind of Pokemon to get KO'd by Buzzwole, unless, of course, they maybe played like 2 copies of Lily. So it's just really strong in general, and I think that Buzzwole is a top archetype in the game. What I'm going to do here is put Buzzwole and Pheromosa right up at the top of A tier. I know technically it's seen a little bit more play than the Kartana version, but if I had to pick one of them, I do think that Kartana Buzzwole is a bit better, really for all of the same reasons that Pheromosa is, except I think that it really comes down to which one is stronger in the head-to-head matchup, and again, I do think that Kartana is a little bit stronger than Pheromosa. Now, one thing I will say is that the Kartana decks are almost always playing at least 1 copy of Pheromosa, where the Pheromosa decks are sometimes not playing any Kartana, right? So I think that, honestly, probably the best way to play Buzzwole is to play both Kartana and Pheromosa, but probably 2 copies of Kartana, and then 1 copy of Pheromosa, and then maybe just only 1 copy of Cyrus, or 2 maybe still. I don't know. The jury's not out yet. It really kind of depends on what's going on in the format right now. One thing is for sure, though, is if we're playing Buzzwole, I think most of the time I would rather have, Kartana, but having Pheromosa is certainly a win condition in its own right. So, yeah, it really is tough to say. I am this week going to probably put maybe 2 or 3 decks in the S tier. It's hard to kind of quantify which decks I believe, will end up, or which deck specifically will end up being the best deck of the format, but we're seeing definitely a clear hierarchy at the top. Talking specifically about this particular Buzzwole Kartana deck, I just feel like it's better against the most other common decks of the format. That's sort of just how I feel. Pheromosa is going to be really good in the, of course, the Rampardos Silvally matchup. Kartana can 1-hit KO a Fossil, so you can play Repel, maybe bring up a Fossil into the active spot early on, either forcing them to discard that Fossil, which is also a really, really strong effect, or, you force them to just sort of have that evolution, and if they don't, then you either KO or they discard the Fossil. Really, really strong. Kartana also, if you're going second, can put on some decent pressure to Type Null, because it has 80 HP, so you're kind of forcing them to evolve and not attack on their next turn. That's also really, really strong. So I like Kartana, particularly just a little bit more. And again, in the head-to-head matchup against a Buzzwole deck that's not playing Kartana, I do think you have an advantage. So I think that that's really what it kind of boils down to. I think that both Buzzwole decks are potentially just S-tier decks, but I want to be a little bit, choosy and picky as to which decks we put into S-tier this week. So I did split up Buzzwole into 2 archetypes. It'll probably end up condensing into 1. They're both extremely similar. Again, it just really comes down to whether you're playing that Pheromosa Cyrus core, or you're maybe playing Kartana with like 1 Cyrus, 1 Repel, or maybe you're playing some Hand Disruption. It really kind of depends, but in my mind, I do think Kartana is just a little bit better to play in Buzzwole right now than Pheromosa. But like I said, even the Kartana Buzzwole decks are playing 1 copy of Pheromosa, which does kind of make it a little bit confusing. So maybe it's not even worth splitting up the archetypes, but anyway, Kartana's broken, Buzzwole's broken, and I think that this deck is definitely going in the S tier. In fact, it might be, in my mind, the best deck in Pokemon Pocket right now. That's kind of how I'm feeling. We'll have to see exactly, how the tier list pans out. But anyway, I think that, Pheromosa in Buzzwole with no Kartana is still really good. I think it's high A tier, but once we add Kartana to the deck, it definitely, in my mind, kind of brings it up to S tier, given the matchups in the top of the metagame right now. Next up is going to be Giratina and Darkrai. So yes, Giratina and Darkrai did win the Ursa Days tournament, the first large, tournament of this particular new format, and I do think that Giratina and Darkrai is still really good. However, I don't believe that it's the best deck in the format, and I don't really believe that it might not even be an S tier choice. The thing with Giratina and Darkrai is that it has really low downside, really high downsides, right? So theoretically speaking, you're never really going to brick with Giratina and Darkrai, whereas a lot of the other decks in the format, you are going to brick. This allows you to kind of, and it's also a deck that only plays 4 Pokemon, so you have a ton of space in your deck to play trainer cards. There's a lot of reasons why Giratina Darkrai is broken. Basic EX Pokemon are inherently more consistent, and these are kind of the 2 strongest basic EX Pokemon in the game, and they go together quite well. So you pair them together, and you're playing, 16 trainer cards. So you can play extra healing to negate a lot of different effects, and you can kind of, negate things like Pheromosa, which is really strong. I think a big reason why Buzzwole is kind of forced to play Kartana is Giratina and Darkrai right now, playing all of those healing cards. But you could also play Hand Disruption, right? So if you're playing against Giratina and Darkrai, and you're playing like 2 Mars or 2 red card or 2 copies of either or whatever, it's just a lot of Hand Disruption in a deck that otherwise is extremely consistent in its own right, which doesn't really get impacted heavily by Hand Disruption. I think that, of course, a late Mars against Giratina Darkrai can win you the game, but for the most part, they're going to get their basic EX Pokemon down, and they're going to get set up, so them just kind of slapping you with a bunch of red cards and Marses feels really bad, especially when you're playing some of these Stage 2 decks that kind of get disrupted quite heavily by the red card and the Mars, which I think does really boost up Giratina and Darkrai significantly, even though, some of the most common decks of the format right now are grass decks that are inherently quite strong against Giratina and Darkrai. I think it's just going to survive for quite a long time because it's consistent and because it's so flexible in the way that we're able to build the deck. I just think that it's going to be sticking around for quite some time. Now, I think some people might think that, you know what, maybe it deserves kind of a, an S tier spot because it did win Ursa Days this week. I really don't think so. If you take a look at the data from the tournament and you take a look at the actual data from the format over the last, 5 or 6 days overall, you'll notice that Giratina and Darkrai actually has a lower average win rate than all of the other most played decks of the format. So I'm not going to say that, the player playing this deck or this deck in particular got lucky at the Ursa Days tournament, but I'm not saying that they didn't get a little bit fortunate. They definitely did. It did not have a great day 2 conversion rate this weekend at the Ursa Days tournament. Again, it did win, but first place doesn't tell the whole story, right? Sometimes, the 4th, 5th, 6th best deck in the format does end up winning that weekend. So that's sort of just how it kind of comes down to it. Giratina Darkrai is still a really, really strong deck. I'm going to be putting it high A tier. Definitely, in my mind, not S tier, given the current format. Too much Buzzwole running around, and I also think that, some of these Stage 2 decks, like Charizard, theoretically, historically does do well against Giratina and Darkrai on paper. I know the Hand Disruption can kind of change that, but overall, I think Solgaleo can struggle, though, which is kind of different. Solgaleo does 120, which just really isn't that great of a number against Giratina and Darkrai, quite honestly, plus they're playing Rocky Helmet and stuff, so yeah, I mean, it is what it is. But that being said, Giratina and Darkrai still a top deck of the format, probably still top 5 or top 6. It's going to go high A tier for me this week. Next up, we're just doing all the heavy hitters right at the beginning of the video for whatever the reason. Next up is going to be Solgaleo and Shiinotic. So this is a really interesting deck that I think kind of popped up, honestly, like right before the Ursa Days tournament, or like it didn't even like fully emerge by the time Ursa Days had started. So it wasn't a deck that really anybody was playing, especially on Ranked Ladder in the first like 2 or 3 days. But come the Ursa Days tournament, it was fairly highly played. I believe it was either the 2nd or 3rd most played deck of the tournament. In the format overall right now, it is the 4th most played deck of this format, and it does have a pretty high win rate. I think for the most part, the reason why people are playing Solgaleo and Shiinotic is because theoretically it has good matchups against Buzzwole and it has good matchups against Rampardos. But one thing I will say is that Shiinotic is a broken card, but it's not a consistent card. This is a deck that, going first can feel quite bad because you can't attack with Solgaleo until turn 3. Not only that, but Solgaleo really can't take KOs. So you are a bit reliant on getting a second Solgaleo set up, or in the same vein, getting something set up really early, or going second and then attacking with Solgaleo on turn 2 to be just a little bit ahead in terms of the damage output. But Buzzwole, of course, can double pivot. You can, force your opponent to have to KO maybe, a Celesteela first, or maybe even like a Kartana and a Pheromosa first, and then also, 2-hit KO on a Buzzwole, and we can pivot a lot. So the Buzzwole matchup doesn't feel that terrible, but theoretically speaking, we do have a favorable matchup against Silvally and Rampardos. Solgaleo being able to KO Celesteela does feel pretty good, and it can KO, of course, a Silvally, which is definitely quite nice. Overall, I think the deck has its inherent issues. I think that this is a little bit more of a solitaire deck in terms of, no matter kind of what the matchups are, you're kind of playing the deck the same exact way, which definitely gives it an advantage in ranked mode because it's a little bit easier to play for players. And its matchups aren't necessarily that much dependent because you can, of course, just blaze through your deck with Shiinotic and then have all of your Pokemon out on turn 3 or turn 4. And if you get Solgaleo out early enough, there's not really much your opponent can do. So it is very much, akin to these sort of rare candy stage 2 decks that really just rely on drawing the cards properly. And if you don't, you probably lose. If you do, you have a really good chance of winning. And for that reason, Solgaleo just feels quite good because its matchup spreads across the entire format. So I think that's something to keep in mind. It is going to struggle for sure, maybe against Giratina and Darkrai a little bit. It is also going to struggle against Charizard, which is still seeing play. So it's tough for me to really gauge it, but if we take a look at its success and its overall win rate, it didn't place like tremendously high, and it didn't do like phenomenal in day 2 of the Ursa tournament, but it did do fairly good and did well enough in my mind to justify it. And I think that it's honestly kind of here to stay. To me, it's fringe. Like, it's definitely fringe, like A, S tier. Again, we have to be a little bit selective, about what decks we're putting into the S tier. So I mean, I don't know if I could really commit to it being an S tier deck. I think it is actually, though, now that I think about it, just because it's win rate. Like, if we're looking at the data, which we have pulled, we have a decent amount of data from the tournaments. It is one of the highest win rate decks in the format. Theoretically speaking, it does have good matchups rather, against some of the most common decks of the format. So, let's go ahead and put Solgaleo and Shiinotic maybe tentatively in the S tier. It might be kind of the bottom of S tier. It's really strong. And I think, honestly, it is really tough to gauge this particular deck. Honestly, I think, the fact that it's simple to play and that it, doesn't really require you to make a lot of different decisions, I think is actually kind of an upside to it. So we're going to go ahead and put it in the S tier just by its inherent strength. And it's also seeing quite a bit of play, right? So if other decks saw more play, it might, and they might, in fact, things like Charizard and Giratina Darkrai might see more play as the week goes on. And going into next weekend, which might drop Solgaleo down a peg. But I think for right now, I still feel fairly comfortable putting it in the S tier. I think it is just kind of a good deck. It is going to brick sometimes. Sometimes it's not going to do anything, but sometimes, you're going to be plus 10 on card advantage on like turn 4, and that's quite ridiculous. I'm not going to lie. So yeah, let's just put it in the S tier for now. I think that's fine. I don't feel like too negative or too strongly about it. I think, honestly, it probably is just an S tier pick. Next up is going to be Decidueye, and this is a kind of a new Decidueye deck with Pheromosa, and you can play the small Decidueye as well, which I think a lot of people are doing. Decidueye was really quite decent last format, however, I do think it kind of got carried by Meowscarada. Now, the issue is Meowscarada is very bad in the current format. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I do have Meowscarada Decidueye on this tier list still, because people are still playing it to some degree. Decidueye, to me, just doesn't feel as strong. Again, I think that Pheromosa is just kind of more heavily countered in this current format than most other decks. In the same vein, I just think there's tons of healing. A lot of these stage 2 decks are playing Lele, so Decidueye definitely needs to go second is kind of what it feels like to me. And if you don't go second when you're playing Decidueye Pheromosa, you are just kind of a sitting duck, and Pheromosa, of course, does just get absolutely rolled over by Silvally, which then, you're kind of reliant on KOing with Decidueye, but Decidueye, of course, only does 80 damage or 100 if the Pokemon already has damage onto it. So if you are playing against Silvally, you are going to struggle a little bit. So going second, this deck can certainly be really good, but Pheromosa, again, is being countered, I would think, a little bit heavily right now by all of the healing in the format. So even Oricorio decks, by the way, are running Shaman. So there's just too much healing, I think, in general right now. Also, like extra HP with like Leaf Cape and Giant Cape. Pheromosa just doesn't feel as good. So I think for the particular breakpoints and just sort of the matchup spreads against the other decks in the format, I don't feel that great about Decidueye. I was pretty hopeful about it, but once we kind of saw what other decks were in the format and how crazy Silvally was and Buzzwole, Decidueye definitely felt like it was on sort of the back burner. It just really wasn't a deck that I think a lot of people jumped at the opportunity to play. Maybe some people tested it, but to me, it just isn't that strong of a deck. I'm going to put Decidueye Pheromosa here into like the B tier. It's probably like a mid B tier deck in my mind. Not a great win rate, about a 47, 48% win rate. Overall in the format, it is like the 8th most played deck. So I mean, yeah, it's not great. It's very much B tier in my mind. So that's where it's going to go. Next up, we've got Giratina and Oricorio. So this is going to be Giratina, Oricorio, probably with Greninja is, I think, what most people are playing. It's interesting. In fact, this was a deck that was really, really common last format. However, I think eventually, you know, Giratina with Tapu, Lele, and Greninja definitely took its place. So it is kind of in an awkward situation. It is a deck that I think some people are still playing, but maybe not playing that much, honestly. But I think it's actually quite underrated. I think that Oricorio has risen up in play quite a bit since Giratina and Darkrai saw more play because it won this weekend. But in general, it's just going to be really good. Oricorio kind of wins Charizard matchups, and it is probably going to win against the Solgaleo matchup as well. So pairing it with Greninja and Giratina does kind of give it a nice pairing, just like it did last format. So you know, this deck, even though it's not seeing nearly as much play at the beginning of this format as it did like at some points in last format, I think it's actually kind of a sleeper pick. I don't know if it will ever rise to popularity, to be honest with you, right? But it does have a pretty decent win rate. I'm going to go ahead and put it also like in the B tier, but higher B tier. I think Oricorio is actually a bit slept on right now. I think a lot of the top decks of the format that people are playing kind of just get hard countered by Oricorio. And, you know, in tournament play, it's not necessarily something you have to, or at least had to take consideration of in this first week, because we kind of knew not many people would play Oricorio in this first week with Silvally Rampardos being everywhere. But I think if Silvally Rampardos declines in play, which it likely will because it didn't perform that well at the Ursa Days tournament, I think that Oricorio is going to see a lot more play, and then I think it'll be more viable, honestly, just because a lot of the top decks of the format just kind of lose to Oricorio. So that's kind of how I feel about it, right? You have Giratina Darkrai, you have Solgaleo, you have Charizard. These are all decks that really just can't handle Oricorio very well. They're not really built to handle it. So that's kind of where Oricorio kind of squeezes in. And there are a variety of different Oricorio decks, as we see. I think there's like 3 or 4 on this particular tier list, which I think is pretty good. And I think they probably deserve to see more play. I'm going to put it in the B tier for now, just because it isn't seeing as much play. I do think theoretically it's actually a fairly decent option in the current format. Giratina is Giratina, and Greninja and Oricorio is a strong combination. We have Irida. I don't know if people will really end up playing it. But anyway, I'm going to put it in the B tier. I feel pretty good about that. Next up, we've got Guzzlord and Nihilego. We actually have 2 different Guzzlord decks, so I think that a lot of people are playing Guzzlord in a very similar way, but they're either just playing it with like Naganadel and then also Nihilego, or they're not playing Naganadel. They're just playing straight Nihilego with maybe like a Darkrai or what is it? Yeah, I think so, right? Or no, with Celesteela, right? So it'd be like this list would be Guzzlord, Nihilego, and Celesteela, so just no Naganadel. I think it's quite strong. I mean, I think Guzzlord is actually quite good. I think the only downside to Guzzlord, to be entirely honest with you, is the aspect of Buzzwole being so common and Grass still being really common in the format, which you do kind of struggle with theoretically. So Guzzlord is kind of meant to be like a frontline Pokemon. It's meant to just soak up damage while you kind of stall your opponent out. And then, of course, after enough time, we can utilize Lusamine to go into a second Guzzlord and potentially just start hitting for 120. That's really the core strategy of the deck. And then you get all of that extra damage with the Nihilego Poison Barb combo. And it's good. It really is good. But unfortunately, you just struggle. A lot of people are playing Guzma still to discard those Poison Barbs. So that's really our only way to poison in the deck. Nihilego becomes quite useless if we don't have Poison Barb active. And then, like I said, Buzzwole is playing Pheromosa and Kartana, so you're just taking a lot of extra damage, and discarding the energies doesn't really matter against Buzzwole at all. Not only are those 2 Pokemon able to attack for 1 energy, but they can just bring those energies back out of the discard pile with Lusamine to put them onto a Buzzwole. So that particular matchup, I think, is really the big downside to playing Guzzlord in the format, and I think Buzzwole will continue to be a really common deck. So for me, it's really tough to kind of put Guzzlord that high on the tier list. I'm going to actually put this one in like the high B tier. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I actually think playing Guzzlord with Naganadel is actually just a bit better. There is actually like a variety of this list that's playing just like Darkrai. Like they're not playing Guzzlord, they're playing just Naganadel, Darkrai, and Nihilego, which I think is quite good, in fact, as well. I didn't include that on the tier list because it's just not nearly as common. So this is going to be like Guzzlord with Naganadel and Celesteela and Nihilego. So it's just sort of the entire Dark type Ultra Beast package, which I think isn't theoretically just a bit better. It may seem a little bit strange, but again, it's nice to not rely on Guzzlord being in the active. Going second or going first, even Naganadel can attack for 1 energy, I believe, which is really strong. And it just honestly is quite good, right? If you get a Nihilego on the bench, that's just a lot of damage. It's a lot of really good pacing with Naganadel, right? Because it does, let me pull it up so I just know exactly what Naganadel does. I don't want to get it wrong. Naganadel has 100 HP, which is actually quite good, right? So with Giant Cape, we can limit an attack from Silvally, but it does 40 damage and then the poison, right? So if we have a Nihilego on our bench, that basically equates to 60 damage, but then also in their turn ends, then that equates to 80 damage, right? And then we can attack again with Naganadel. So going first, it is actually quite strong. Even going second, it can be quite good. But I think that it's pretty decent. It functions very similarly to like how Kartana and Pheromosa function with Buzzwole, because we can kind of Lucamine those energies back up, right? So theoretically speaking, we can always Lucamine to a Celesteela or to a Naganadel or to a Nihilego or Guzzlord, right? So we have a lot of targets in this deck for Lucamine, and I think that's really good. But honestly, I just think that Naganadel gives enough pace right now. With the poison, it's kind of worth running, and I think that it just makes it a little bit more consistent because we're not reliant on Poison Barb, which again, with Guzma running around, and then of course you have to draw into Poison Barb, it just doesn't really happen that often. Naganadel's also not weak to grass. So we are living 2 attacks from Kartana, which is very, very relevant, right? So I think that's a big reason. I think Naganadel is just a little bit better of a leadoff right now than, of course, Guzzlord is with all of the grass decks running around. So this deck goes into the A tier. I think it is actually quite good. It's not seeing like a ton of play, I believe. You know, Guzzlord is both like, without Naganadel is the 11th most played deck with a 50% win rate. And then with Naganadel, it's the 18th most played deck of this format so far, but has a 53% win rate. So I think this is definitely a lot better. I think it deserves to see more play. I think for whatever the reason, people are just maybe a little bit shy of playing it based around all of the grass that's in the format. Not only that, but of course, Silvally Rampardos is running around. So yeah, it is what it is, right? Definitely still a strong deck. I'm going to put it A tier. It's probably like mid to low A tier. Next up, what do we got? We've got Tapu Koko, and Tapu Koko is an interesting one, definitely. Now, I don't know how strongly I feel about Tapu Koko. I know it had a little bit of hype early on. Electrical Cord with like Pikachu EX, that's sort of what this archetype is, right? You're playing Zeraora. It's got a lot of different stuff going around, and like theoretically speaking, it's not terrible. But in the same vein, it's really not that good. I just think 130 HP is a little bit of a downside. There's just too many like ramp decks and too many setup decks that can kind of like rebound, right? And especially against Buzzwole, like Buzzwole's ability to not only just like heal a bunch, but to have a bunch of HP keeps you kind of safe from getting KO'd by Tapu Koko that early. And in the same vein, if Tapu Koko goes first, then you can't even do the 90 damage until your 3rd turn, which feels bad. Like it does. It feels genuinely quite bad. And that's, I think, the biggest downside to Tapu Koko is it really is a going second deck, and there's stronger going second decks in the format. Rampardos, when it KOs you, you know, we don't have like a ton of room. We are playing Oricorio, but if we're playing Oricorio, we're not really that reliant on Tapu Koko. You know what I mean? Like Oricorio pairs probably a bit better with Magnezone or even Silvally. So yeah, I think that Tapu Koko is a little bit disappointing overall. It hasn't seen a ton of play. It's got a 47% win rate so far of this format. Like I said, I think there's better ways to play Oricorio personally, and I think that Tapu Koko is just a bit underwhelming. It's sad because I think that they're very I guess on the fence about giving us strong electric type Pokemon because Oricorio is in the format and they know how strong Oricorio is. And I mean, the people that make Pokemon Pocket and develop the game, I think they're a little bit hesitant to give a strong electric-type Pokemon. Tapu Koko technically is a result of power creep, and theoretically it is better than Genetic Apex Pikachu, but I don't think it's that good, honestly. I really don't. 130 HP is just tough, even with Cape. You know, you're just kind of getting KO'd quite easily, and we're not really KOing anything that consistently. Too much healing in the format, too many high HP Pokemon. Just doesn't really feel that great. So Tapu Koko to me is also probably like a low B tier, mid to low B tier. I think it's very similar maybe to Decidueye. These are decks that I would be like shocked to see them like win a tournament. I really, really would. I just don't think they're that good. I really don't. I mean, you could play like multiple Oricorios. My door just closed on its own. A little bit scary. You could play multiple Oricorios and then theoretically just win that way. But like, I mean, at that point, like how good is Tapu Koko really? You know what I mean? So this might be a bit disrespectful, but I just can't, I just don't think it's that good. It's not something I would really recommend playing. Now, speaking of things that are good, we have Silvally and Rampardos. So here it is. Silvally Rampardos is the most played deck of this format so far. And it was the most played deck at Ursa Day's tournament. It did pretty well at Ursa Day's, but it didn't have a great, it had a really good day 1 theoretically. But it had a good day 2 conversion rate, but it didn't have a good performance in day 2. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more right now. And I talked about it in Meta Monday. Silvally Rampardos does really good into like the greater field, right? So theoretically speaking, Silvally Rampardos is a really, really strong deck. And it is what I would say the format is kind of being shaped around. Silvally in general is absolutely insane. Going second, doing 100 damage is absolutely ridiculous. You can do 40 into 100, and then, you know, if your opponent doesn't have like a way to like not be in the active spot or whatever, then you're just kind of KOing a lot of different Pokemon. It's got really good pace. Rampardos as well can just attack for 1 energy and do 130. So it's absolutely insane. This deck is very, very good. I think that going first, it's dramatically worse, but I still think that it's really, really good. However, there's a lot of counters to it that have formulated in the meta. And again, that's a result of the metagame, I think, really being shaped around Silvally Rampardos. I think it's a big reason why Buzzwole is so good right now, and I think it's a big reason why Giratina Darkrai sees play right now with Hand Disruption, Solgaleo as well. These are all decks that are kind of the next most played decks, but are kind of there specifically because they do quite well against Silvally Rampardos. Now, why did Silvally Rampardos have such a good day 1 in the Swiss rounds, but struggled in day 2 and in the top cut bracket? The main reason for that is because Silvally Rampardos does really, really good against all of the decks that are going to be below it on the tier list, but any of the decks that are sort of right next to it on the tier list, it struggles with. So I think that's a big reason why Silvally Rampardos maybe didn't do very well in the overall results of the tournament and in the final standings, was because in day 2, it ended up playing mostly Buzzwole decks. It ended up playing mostly Giratina Darkrai, mostly the mirror match, and then mostly Solgaleo. And honestly, when you take a look at that matchup spread for Silvally Rampardos, you kind of understand why it's not doing so well. So this is one of those decks where the average win rate kind of doesn't tell the whole story. Silvally Rampardos is kind of like the pub stomper of the format, again, which is kind of what we kind of, it's the gatekeeper, right? It's the gatekeeper of the format. Theoretically speaking, if you're not playing Silvally Rampardos in like low rank tiers, you're going to be at a disadvantage because you're going to be playing against Silvally Rampardos, right? So right now in the format, it does feel a little bit not great because of this deck. So you're either playing Silvally Rampardos or you're playing probably, the 3, 4, or 5 decks that are, not Silvally Rampardos, but are also top decks. So it's kind of gatekeeping, and we've seen this in other decks of the format. At least there are a variety of different counters to it, and it is somewhat balanced in the sense that if it goes first, you definitely have a pretty good shot. I think Silvally would be kind of balanced without Gladion, but Gladion exists, and I think Rampardos would be balanced if, I guess if it had like maybe less HP, or if it, I think Rampardos honestly should probably take damage every time it attacks and not when it takes a KO. That's just my own sort of, brain, my own opinions there. Silvally Rampardos is really good. It's got to go in the S tier because it is sort of a gatekeeping deck. I don't know if I would put it like above Solgaleo and Shiinotic, but I don't know. It certainly wouldn't be above Buzzwole. I think Buzzwole's like the GOAT right now. I think it's the top deck. And I think Solgaleo I actually might even put above it, but I don't know. We'll put it like right here. We'll put it in the middle. I think it's definitely, it's got to go S tier because not only is it the most played deck, but it had the best, I guess, results in day 1. It is sort of the gatekeeper of the format right now, which doesn't feel great. So you're either playing this deck or you're playing a deck that's good against this deck remotely, or you're probably going to struggle, honestly, especially at the higher ranks of the format and in ranked battles and in tournament, honestly. So there we go. Silvally Rampardos. We are 33 minutes into this video. We got to pick up the pace. It's okay if this is an hour long, right? It's the first tier list of the format. It's okay if it's an hour long. I think some people enjoy the long videos. I get a little bit, self-conscious about them, but there's so much to talk about. And I like the tier lists because it is really kind of our time to sit down and speak about, everything, I guess, all at once, which is quite nice. Okay. Next up, we've got Gallade and Stoutland. So this is like our main fringe meta culprit right now. I think so far, everything that we've covered in the tier list is like meta, but like maybe not like tier 1 meta, or like everything in that we've kind of talked about here is at least in the metagame to some degree. Gallade Stoutland is definitely like kind of like the meme deck right now of the format, or like the fringe deck of the format. But here's the thing, is like it's not bad. So decks like these are interesting because they are actually not bad decks at all, but they're just never something that I think is going to catch on and see like a ton of play. So you could look at this as like a YouTube content deck, but Stoutland and Gallade actually do have some good synergies. This is a deck that can certainly brick quite easily. Both of these Pokemon have 2 energies in their attack cost, right? Which is a downside. So going first, we really can't do anything until turn 3. And of course, Stoutland is weak to fighting, which is tough because Rampardos does KO you. But the cool thing about Stoutland, if you don't know what it does, is that it forces your opponent to have 1 extra energy in their attack cost and in their retreat cost. So you can kind of stall for a little bit. So it is pretty fun to just sort of evolve into Stoutland early and then force your opponent to attach an extra energy. Against Buzzwole, it's probably not going to go that well because they can kind of conserve energies really easily. And then in low energy attack cost decks, it's probably not that great either way. But it synergizes well with Gallade because Gallade does more damage based on how many energies are attached to your opponent's Pokemon. So theoretically speaking, there's a lot of Pokemon that probably need 4 or 5 energies to use their attack if Stoutland's in the active spot. And then Gallade can kind of come in and then KO those Pokemon. That's really what it comes down to. A lot of high HP Pokemon here, but a lot of stage 2 Pokemon. It's all stage 2 Pokemon, quite frankly. And they have 2 energies in their attack cost, which does inherently make the deck a bit inconsistent. The upside to Gallade, though, is that it's weak to Psychic, and it's not weak to Grass, like other fighting decks are. However, that's not actually that much of an upside because Giratina is still really, really common in the format. Giratina will KO Gallade. It just will. And that's just the reality of it. So, yeah. Gallade and Stoutland is interesting. I mean, come on. I can't put this in I don't know if I can put it in the B tier. I really can't, because it is sort of like a YouTube content deck, right? It's really not seeing much play. I mean, its win rate is pretty decent, but it's not. I can't. We can't just be throwing Gallade, Stoutland up in like the A or B tier. B tier is really where I reserve for like the decks that are maybe not super good, but I think are still meta. Gallade to me is like not really meta yet. Maybe it sees more play and more success as the weeks go on. I'm gonna put it right there into the C tier. I think it's definitely better than D tier, so I think it kind of deserves a little C tier mention. I don't know if I reserved. No, I think we did. Okay. I was gonna say I don't know if I put anything in here that would be D tier, but we'll see. We'll see. We need at least one deck in the D tier, right? Okay, what's up next? We've got Silvally and Zeraora, which is basically Electro-type Silvally, which plays Zeraora, but it also plays either 1 or 2 copies of Oricorio. Now, here's the thing. Silvally is Silvally, and it's really quite good. So when you pair it with Zeraora, it actually does give you some flexibility with Dawn. So I think that Zeraora and Silvally actually combo quite well. It allows you to kind of bypass some of that struggles of going first with Silvally, which in general is quite strong. So the idea of the main core of the deck is basically Dawn combo with Zeraora and Silvally, and theoretically, we can kind of bypass sort of the struggles of Silvally and the awkwardness of it if we're not going second. Now, inherently, this deck is going to have some awkwardness and, I guess, inconsistency to it because we're not playing it with just like a fossil Pokemon, which means we're not guaranteed to even start with Silvally. And then Zeraora is a combo piece that's really cool, but you have to start with Zeraora on your bench or in play on your first turn, or else it's kind of useless. So that's sort of the one downside to this deck, is that inherently, like the ideal starting combo for this deck is really, really strong, one of the best early games in the format, and we do have Oricorio to lean back on, but in the same vein, I just don't think that it's like consistent enough. And of course, Silvally isn't something that's really gonna like win games in its own right? I mean, the main reason why Silvally and Rampardos is so good is because like Silvally is like one of the best leadoffs in the game, if not the best leadoff in the game, and then we just have Rampardos, which is broken, right? So playing a deck that is kind of centered around Silvally is going to be really good, but I think it kind of needs that late game partner to really be like an S tier quality deck, which we'll talk about in a little bit, of course, yet again. But Silvally, electric type Silvally is what we call it. Really, there's 3 different types that we're playing Silvally in, at least at the moment. One is going to be fighting with Rampardos, one is going to be electric type with Zeraora and Oricorio, and then we also have Charizard in Silvally, which we will get to in a little bit. We did make a video on it a few days ago. So yeah, Silvally, electric-type Silvally is quite good. It really is. I mean, it's got a pretty decent win rate. I hadn't seen a ton of play. It's like the 20th most played deck right now of the format, but it does have a 53% or 54% record, which is quite good in a small sample size. We'll have to really see. Man, I mean, we're going to put it in the A tier. I think Silvally's good enough to kind of just justify an A tier placement. Oricorio's good enough in the format right now. I mean, I think it's good. I mean, I could go like high B tier, but I'm going to put it like low A tier is kind of where I'm going to reserve it for now. I think Silvally's just broken in general. So I think most Silvally decks are going to actually be quite good just based off the fact that you have Silvally. And I think that's a good enough reason to play it, quite honestly. Next up, we've got Giratina and Magnezone. I believe Giratina and Magnezone struggled at the Ursa Days tournament, but I'm looking at the overall metadata right now for the entire format as a whole. Giratina and Magnezone is still the 9th most played deck. I do believe it's declining in play, but it has a 51% win rate. I think that Giratina and Magnezone is quite fine. I think that Magnezone actually still does quite well against a lot of things in the format. I do think that it's a little bit disenfranchised, at least at the moment right now, because last format, the big reason why Magnezone saw a resurgence in play was because it was kind of one of the main counters to Meowscarada, and Meowscarada was phenomenal last format. So without Meowscarada really seeing any play, it's kind of tough to justify Magnezone. Now, of course, it is going to be able to KO things like Silvally, which is definitely an upside to it. but Silvally's got a little bit of a quicker pace than Magnezone. But theoretically speaking, this deck still plays Tapu Lele. So like you have like the Tapu Lele strats and you have Giratina. This is a deck that's playing Psychic Energies. So of course you can basically just kind of go with like the Giratina Tapu Lele strat, and Magnezone is just kind of there in case you do draw into it and you can get it set up. So I do like the deck. I don't know if it's as well positioned as it was last format. Again, it's probably declining in play. It hasn't seen a ton of play early on, so it's hard for me to really gauge. Early on in the format, it's tough for us to put decks that aren't seeing a ton of play in like A or S tier, just because we don't know if like we don't have a large sample size. So the data we do have doesn't really tell us too much. It's more so based off of my personal opinion. And I think that this is totally a fine deck. I'm going to go ahead and I believe I'm going to put Magnezone still A tier. We are. I'm going to put it like low A tier, honestly. I think Magnezone is good. I do. I think that Giratina, so you're basically playing like Psychic Giratina. You don't even need Tapu Lele. You can just play Psychic Giratina and then play Magnezone, and you're probably a pretty decent deck. I genuinely believe that. Two really strong cards. Psychic Giratina being able to attack on turn 3, have a lot of HP. Magnezone also a lot of HP, can kind of set itself up. Just kind of two broken cards that kind of go together a little bit better than we think they should. Yeah, low A tier I think probably seems fine. We could justify like a high B tier, but I think low A tier is probably okay. I don't know, actually. Let's be a little bit more selective with the A tier. I don't want A tier to be overwhelmed. I'm going to put it like high B tier. I'll put it like right here next to like Oricorio and in Giratina. I know that's a big drop off, but yeah, let's just put it right here. I don't want to jump the gun a little bit too much because again, it's a deck that's not going to like rise and play. It just won't, right? So considering the fact that not many people are going to play it over the next few weeks, I think B tier is probably all right. Let's just put it like right here. Actually, no, I am going to put it above Guzzlord. I am. This is going to be one of those decks that I think is like never going to see that much play, but it's just still good. I think people are just kind of bored of it, quite honestly. Next up, we've got Giratina, Tapu Lele, and then this is going to be with Greninja. So this is an interesting one. I think that Tapu Lele is not really good in the format, quite honestly. I think that a lot of the Stage 2 decks have way too much healing. Rampardos is really common, and that just attacks for 1 energy. Solgaleo only attacks for 2 energies, and it also plays Lily. Buzzwole, of course, doesn't even need to attach energies until your Pokemon get KO'd, and then you can just, of course, play your Lucamine, right? So you can kind of bypass the Tapu Lele stuff. And then, of course, this is a deck that's still going to be good against Giratina and Darkrai. So that is definitely an upside, but against like the entire field, I just don't really feel that strong about Tapu Lele in the current format right now. And I think that we're not playing Magnezone, and Magnezone just does kind of make the deck better. Greninja can be certainly quite good. I think the Greninja-Giratina combo, this is also playing Psychic Energies, I think is really kind of what carries the deck, honestly. But, I don't know. I just don't know. I think there's too much healing. I do. There's too much Leaf Cape. There's too much, like, Erica's, Pokemon Center Lady, Potion, Giant Cape, Lilies. There's just too much of that in the format to really rely on this particular combination. Still a deck that can be really strong, but you got to get all your Pokemon out properly. You got to get Giratina out early. You got to get Greninja out somewhat early. You got to draw into your Cyruses. I think there's better sort of combinations in the format right now that are just a little bit more consistent. So I'm going to be putting Giratina and Tapu Lele, actually with Greninja rather, in the C tier. I think it's just a C tier deck. I do. It hasn't seen that much play. So it's the 16th most played deck of the format so far, and it has a 41% win rate, which is bad. I mean, I know it's a small sample size, but 74 and 99 is a bad record, honestly, even though I know it's a small sample size. So I don't feel strongly about Tapu Lele in general. And I think, again, I'm looking at this like not really considering Tapu Lele. So if we're comparing it to Giratina and Magnezone, I think I would rather play the Giratina Magnezone combination, and then I would, play Giratina and Greninja personally. So that's just my opinion. Yeah, I mean, again, you have to also think like Tapu Lele's not a great leadoff because you die to Silvally on turn 2, and that's of course doesn't feel good by any stretch of the imagination. So Silvally, again, kind of gatekeeping for sure. Yeah, there it is. Okay. What do we got next on the tier list here? We have Charizard. Let's actually just knock out like all of the Charizard decks like all at once. Yeah, so I'm going to categorize Charizard into 3 main ways that people are playing it. We'll do them in order of popularity. So that's going to be Charizard and Incineroar, which is actually still the 5th most played deck of the format. And it's not doing that good, honestly. I think that this is a deck that still loses to Oricorio, and you're going to struggle against basically everything that's not like Buzzwole. Charizard, theoretically, in its own right, does beat Solgaleo and does beat Buzzwole, but it's inherently inconsistent. If we don't get Stoke off on our 2nd turn, and if we don't get it off on our 3rd turn, we're definitely probably not going to win just because our opponent is just way too in our face. And Silvally is just so fast paced that, theoretically speaking, any kind of, times where we don't like have good pace and we don't draw into our rare candy combo early enough, we just kind of don't cut it. Also, Incineroar is not as useful as you might think. Buzzwole with Leaf Cape lives in a 140 attack from Incineroar, so that's bad. So especially if Buzzwole attacks first on Incineroar, it's getting the KO, and that doesn't feel great, right? It just doesn't. There's also like repel in the format too, so it just makes things a bit awkward because if you lead with Charmander, they can repel you into like your bench Litten, and then you're just in like kind of an awkward spot. I mean, it's fine. It is sort of a high roll deck, but I just don't know if it's like really worth playing considering all of the Silvally Rampardos, all of the Giratina Darkrai with Hand Disruption, the other Charizard decks, even Solgaleo, which is a bit more consistent in terms of because it plays Shiinotic, even though it does lose technically against Charizard in the head-to-head. I think I would probably just rather play Solgaleo. So Charizard Incineroar is a bit awkward to me. I think that it's probably like a high B tier deck. People are thinking I'm going to be disrespecting the fire decks, but I'm not actually going to disrespect fire decks at all in this video. I'm just going to be completely real with how I believe the fire decks are, because I think that a lot of people have like weird conceptions about the fire decks. And I think that they're like, okay, but I don't, we'll see in a little bit. Anyway, Charizard Incineroar, inherently inconsistent, struggles against Giratina Darkrai. Silvally Rampardos kind of outpaces it a bit. Also, Rampardos is Rampardos, so 130. You're going to have to eat that. If we don't evolve early, if we don't draw into lilies, we're kind of cooked. That's what the deck comes down to. So it's a high roll deck, but I think there's better high roll decks in the format. So we're going to go ahead and put it like high B tier. We're just going to kind of put it right there. B tier might get a little bit flooded as this goes on a little bit. Next up is going to be Turtonator and Charizard, which is the 10th most played deck of the format and has also a 48% win rate. So a little bit of an under kind of performing deck. Both of them are 48, 47, 49% win rates. And yeah, I think Turtonator is fine, but unfortunately also inconsistent, right? So I mean, yeah. What can we say about Turtonator other than the fact that like both Turtonator and Charizard require like 2 or 3 card combos that, and if you're playing both of those combos, theoretically, you would think you would get one of those combos out. But Turtonator is a combo that you kind of need to get out early, and same with Charizard. So if you don't get either of the combinations, like there are times where we lead Turtonator, right? And then we don't draw Kiawe's, and you can't just retreat with Turtonator. It's got 4 energy in its retreat cost, which means we're kind of waiting around. And if we lead Charmander, but we don't draw the rare candy combo, then we're going to get farmed by Silvally, right? So it's just an awkward situation. Turtonator, when compared to Silvally, is a much less good leadoff option. Silvally has more HP, so it's living an attack from Turtonator, and we're also able to KO it when we attack with type Null and then attack, right, with Silvally. So if we're going second, Turtonator dies by turn 2, and we can't even take a KO, which again is just quite bad because we can't attack on that first turn. We have to attack on the second turn, but they've evolved by then. It just doesn't feel great into Silvally. And then, like I said, Charizard is good, but it's inherently inconsistent. So I wouldn't be pairing Turtonator with Charizard right now, personally. I really wouldn't. I don't think this deserves to see play. I'm going to put it below Charizard here in the B tier. The tiers aren't really in order. They're kind of in order, but not really. I think it's actually just worse than Charizard Incineroar. In fact, I'm going to just put it like bottom B tier there, behind all of the other decks. I think Charizard Incineroar is like high B tier. I think Charizard Turtonator is kind of like lower B tier, is how I feel. But next up, we've got Silvally and Charizard. So here, now we're talking. Silvally Charizard is, in fact, in my mind, the best way to play Charizard. And I really do believe that. I know some people were playing it with Wigglytuff, so some people might be like, oh, what about Charizard Wigglytuff? I think that's a meme. I don't think you should play Charizard Wigglytuff. Personally, I just don't think it's that good. The upside to pairing Silvally with Charizard is that Silvally is very consistent, right? So now we're playing Charizard just with a better leadoff, so it's similar to Turtonator, except now Silvally is just much more consistent. The other upside is that Silvally thins the deck out because you're playing Gladion, right? So that's inherently quite good. And Silvally can kind of carry its own, and then in the late game, we can kind of just go into Charizard, we can Stoke, and then probably just take a KO. So it honestly is a bit better. It just is. I think that Silvally makes most decks that it pairs with just better, and I think that Silvally Charizard is, in my mind, the best way to play Charizard right now. So I think it deserves to see more play. Hopefully some people see this tier list and they sort of stop playing Charizard the other ways. I mean, Incineroar is fine if you wanted to pair it with Incineroar, but I think Silvally in general is just a bit better. And Charizard, like I said, wins in a head-to-head against Buzzwole, and it wins in a head-to-head against Solgaleo. So that's, I think, the main upsides to playing Charizard, and Silvally in its own right gives you enough pressure to potentially just sort of take an advantage in the early game, especially if we're going second, right? So there you go. Charizard Silvally is going into the A tier. I'm going to put it actually right, I'm going to put it right here. I'm going to put it like middle A tier. I think it's totally good. I think it's definitely a decent deck. I think it's a top 10 deck in the format. I think it's good. I do. Charizard Silvally. is my recommendation if you're playing a fire type deck in the current format. Now you can actually, which I think is pretty funny, I think we've hit a weird boiling point where I think that we don't have any like pure Incineroar decks on this format either. I think they have potential. I think Silvally Incineroar, by the way, could be quite good. I think Turtonator Incineroar could be even better than Charizard, but not enough people are playing just sort of core Incineroar decks for us to put it on the tier list. So keep that in mind. Incineroar isn't something that is as common nearly as Charizard, so I can't really rank it. Maybe if Incineroar deck rises in play, it might make a tier list, but for this week, it didn't make the tier list. But yeah, that's kind of how I feel about that right there. Where was my train of thought? What was I saying? I forget. I really do. I don't know what I was talking about before that. But anyway, yeah, Charizard Incineroar is fine, but I would prefer Charizard Silvally. I think it's definitely a top deck in the current format, or at least one of the top, I say top, like a top 5, top 10. Okay, next up, we've got Magnezone and Oricorio. So yeah, this is, I think, a leftover from, the old format. This did win the largest Pokemon Pocket tournament of all time a couple of weeks ago only, but things have changed very, very drastically since then. I think that Oricorio is actually better now than it was at the beginning of the format, but unfortunately, Silvally Rampardos is running around. Rampardos does beat Magnezone, Silvally does beat Oricorio, so it's really tough. It's tough for me to really recommend playing Magnezone and Oricorio in a format where the most played deck is Silvally Rampardos. This deck is kind of built specifically to beat Magnezone Oricorio, which feels bad if we're being, if I'm just going to be honest, which I'm always honest, you guys, I say that a lot. I'm always honest with you guys. Yeah, Magnezone Oricorio is not something I can heavily recommend right now. Unfortunately, I think that the deck inherently is good, but its positioning in the format, I think, again, kind of just gatekept by Silvally Rampardos. Also probably struggles against Buzzwole, if we're being honest with you. But yeah, let's go ahead and put it in the C tier. I think is probably where this deck belongs. Don't have too much else to say about it, but I do think that it is still quite a good deck. What do we got next? Garchomp. Shout out to Garchomp. So Garchomp actually had a pretty good little run in the Ursa Days tournament the other day. Overall, Garchomp has struggled in the format, but the cool thing about Garchomp is that it is specifically quite good against Silvally Rampardos for a variety of reasons. I think, of course, Silvally's weak to fighting, so Garchomp can KO it, but I think it really just comes down to linear attack, being able to snipe your opponent's fossils. That gives you an upside if we rare candy turn 2, if we're going first, then Garchomp can kind of handle the fossils, and that really puts you in a winning scenario. So specifically, I think Garchomp is good against Silvally Rampardos, and it kind of fit this funny niche where in like day 2, and even in Swiss rounds, there was a couple of decks that ended up just kind of making it pretty far in the tournament because of its inherent good matchup against Silvally and Rampardos. Now, it is something that's not great against a lot of the other decks of the format, predominantly Buzzwole, which is very, very common. Giratina Darkrai as well certainly has a decent matchup against it. Even Solgaleo could probably handle Garchomp pretty handily, so keep that in mind, right? Lele, you are living 2 attacks from Garchomp, so it doesn't feel that good. Yeah, so I don't think Garchomp is terrible. I think, honestly, in a format, again, that is really centered around Silvally Rampardos, to me, Garchomp and Rampardos is a really interesting, like, hard counter to it. I say hard counter. It's not like an auto win-win to any stretch of the imagination. In fact, we can look, but I think that theoretically speaking, Garchomp Rampardos should be pretty good in this current format. I don't know if it really is that good, but also Oricorio is running around. So I mean, you could play fighting type Gible and kind of farm some of these electric type decks, which are still kind of common. And definitely we should do good against Oricorio, right? So yeah, there's that. I'm gonna put Garchomp in like the low B tier. I don't know exactly where. I'll put it like middle B tier actually. I'll put it like above Charizard Turtonator. So that's still probably low B tier, but it's a B tier deck. It is. I think it's totally fine. I do. I like Garchomp, and I think I don't know if I would play it, especially like on the ranked ladder right now. But I think like in tournaments, and I think just in general, Garchomp's a strong deck, but probably has been kind of pushed out of the format by Silvally Rampardos because Silvally Rampardos is just probably a better deck. But Garchomp specifically should maybe have an advantage in that head-to-head matchup. Theoretically speaking, we don't really have enough data to quantify that. So like they probably played like across the format right now, these two decks have probably hit each other a total of like 10, 15 times. So I don't think that data is really worth it. But I mean, theoretically, it has a good matchup into Silvally Rampardos, but we don't really have the data to say that. That's just my own opinion. But I mean, yeah, like I said, it is what it is, right? Garchomp's Garchomp, we all know it. Some people like it, some people maybe not. I always liked Garchomp, but okay, next up is Arceus, Dark Arceus. So yeah, I think that right now, basically the way that people are playing Arceus is probably just going to be with, like Giratina and Darkrai, right? So it's the deck that kind of popped up at the end of last format, which is really just a mashup of Giratina and Darkrai, and then Crobat and Arceus. I don't think that many people are playing Carnivine. I don't think Carnivine's very good in a format with Silvally. So I think for the most part, this deck is kind of inherently built around the same sort of aspects that it was before, where If it gets fully set up, if you get all your Pokemon in play, you can kind of KO anything, right? I mean, Giratina does 130, plus a Darkrai ping is 150, plus a Crobat ping is 180. So yeah, we're KOing basically everything in the format if we get the full board state set up. Not something that always happens, but inherently speaking, this is a deck that can kind of always win. Crobat also should theoretically help you in the Oricorio matchup, right? Because we are playing Dark Energies in the deck. So that inherently does, I guess, improve our matchup against Oricorio. I think we probably will struggle against Buzzwole. I'll just flat out say it. We might even struggle against, Solgaleo or even Charizard. I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know specifically what the matchups for this particular deck are. I bet it's probably just fairly decent across the board. I'm just going to check right now. So yeah, it actually does really well against, it does pretty good against Silvally Rampardos. It does really good against Giratina Darkrai. It does good against, I guess, really all of the bad decks in the format, and then it struggles really against Buzzwole and Solgaleo. So I guess there you go. That's the matchup spread for this particular deck. I haven't looked into it until right now. But yeah, gonna be good against everything other than, Buzzwole and Solgaleo, which are pretty common in the format. So I don't know from like a ranked ladder perspective if that's something I would, really consider. But in a tournament net setting, it certainly is good. And I think it got like top 20 at the Days tournament. It's not seeing a ton of play. It's the 12th most played deck of the format right now, but does have a 54% win rate. So kind of also like a pub stomper deck, but theoretically we should be good against Giratina Darkrai. So maybe we'll see more play. It's a good deck. I do. I think it's totally fine. It is also kind of a solitaire deck. We're going to put it in the A tier, lower A tier. It's going to go like right up here. I'll put it actually above Naganadel and Guzzlord. I think it's kind of middle A tier with Silvally Rampardos. So I think it goes like in here somewhere, and I think that's probably pretty safe. Honestly, I don't know what I can really tell you about Arceus and Crobat. It's one of those decks. It's kind of a pile. It's what we call that. It's a pile. Just a pile of cards that are all pretty good, and then if you get them all out, you're kind of doing pretty good, but it's maybe a little bit tough to get them all out, right? Definitely not a very consistent deck in the early game, but in the late game, if you get set up, it's gonna be kind of crazy. What do we got? So Solgaleo and Silvally, Skarmory. So Solgaleo and Skarmory, it has seen play early on in the format. This is a deck that I think is going to be kind of entirely out of the format as time goes on. I think it's really just here on the tier list because it was one of the most played decks of last format, and people still kind of played it going into this new format. It's definitely going to drop off in play significantly. Shiinotic is much, much better to pair with Solgaleo. Just makes going into Solgaleo that much more consistent, and theoretically speaking, that's the whole idea with Solgaleo is you want two of them. Because they have low energy in their attack cost and they can kind of come in for free. So that's the idea with Shiinotic Solgaleo. When you pair it with Skarmory, you don't have any more inherent consistency. In fact, you're a bit less consistent. And Skarmory, again, not as good of a leadoff as, of course, Silvally is, right? So that's the issue, I think, in the format right now. You could actually play Silvally and Solgaleo, and it might be pretty good. Honestly, it would probably be better than this. Anyway. Solgaleo Skarmory is bad. It's going D tier. It is. It honestly was never very good last format. I think it was like C tier last format. I think it's even worse now, honestly. And especially since there's another Solgaleo deck, which is actually in S tier this week. RIP to Skarmory. It was a card that was like somewhat good, but like never ended up being that good. And now it's just not good at all because Silvally just gatekeeps all of the leadoff Pokemon in the game, unfortunately. So yeah, there it goes. Solgaleo and Skarmory, unfortunately, finding its way all the way down in D tier this week. We're leaving some bad decks for last. Next up is going to be Gallade and Rampardos. So yes, we did talk about Gallade and Stoutland, but Gallade Rampardos is actually still seeing more play than Gallade and Stoutland is. Again, it's a remnant of the previous format. It's a deck that just isn't that good. Technically speaking, Rampardos is okay, but I don't think you have an inherent advantage playing Rampardos with Gallade like you do Stoutland and Gallade. At least there's some synergy here. Rampardos and Gallade is like, oh, cool. Like, I'm just hoping I kind of draw into one of these, and then Gallade's probably not doing anything for me in the early game, and Rampardos probably isn't coming out in the early game. So it just doesn't feel necessarily as great as maybe some of the other decks of the format, especially fighting decks, which there are a couple. I guess there's really not that many. It's all going in D tier as well. Sorry, Gallade. I just don't think Gallade in general is that good. Being able to get KO'd by Giratina is just bad. But not only that, I don't know. I think, like I said, Gallade gets buffed a little bit by Stoutland in that synergy, but when we're not playing Stoutland, Gallade feels underwhelming, and then we're just kind of playing Rampardos and another Stage 2 Pokemon that's not really good in the format. and I just don't really think it's kind of worth playing in general. A lot of low energy attack cost in the format right now anyway, so theoretically Gallade can KO Silvally, but I mean, you're probably just going to get KO'd before you can evolve anyway, right? So yeah, Gallade going into the D tier. And then next up, we've got Meowscarada and Decidueye, or lastly, we have Meowscarada and Decidueye, which funnily enough is so far of the first week, the 7th most played deck of the format. Again, a remnant of the previous format. This is a deck that's going to fall off quite dramatically, and Meowscarada is just not good. It's not good for a variety of reasons, mainly because Silvally. There's just a lot of Pokemon that are going to, KO Decidueye before it can get KO'd. Also, Rampardos beats Meowscarada in the head-to-head. It actually does. Like, Rampardos actually lives 2 attacks from a Decidueye, I believe. No, it doesn't. Decidueye does, I guess it's 80 for weakness, but Rampardos hits for 130. So, I mean, it is just kind of better, I think. Either way, Meowscarada is not very good. It was good last format and then kind of kept in check by Magnezone, but Meowscarada really doesn't see any play right now, mostly because of Silvally. Again, just sort of gatekeeping other, older cards out of the format. So, unfortunately, I think Decidueye is okay, but if we're playing Decidueye, I really would not pair it with Meowscarada. This is, again, the 7th most played deck of the format so far, definitely on the decline, and has a 43% win rate, which is bad. It is quite bad in general. I think Meowscarada has potential. I think, again, it just kind of has been getting gatekeeped by Silvally. It just, like, it can't. You're just getting KO'd by Silvally, and you're only doing 60 damage to it. Silvally, is a stage 2 Pokemon. Or, sorry, Silvally's a stage 1 Pokemon that's going to hit you for 100. Meowscarada is a stage 2 Pokemon that's going to hit you back for 60. So that's definitely not very good. And, yeah, there it is. Also going in the D tier. There you go. That's the tier list this week, guys. Let me know what you guys think. I'm sure some people might agree with some stuff, but some people might disagree with other stuff. This is kind of how I feel. I think that S tier right now are really meta-defining decks. These are not only, I believe, like the 3 most played decks of the format, but inherently, I think probably like the 3 strongest decks of the format. Buzzwole is split up into 2 categories, but I mean, I still think that this Buzzwole is actually better than Giratina Darkrai. I know some people might disagree with Giratina Darkrai not even being like at the top of A tier because it won Ursa Days, but no, I think it's probably like the 4th or 5th best deck in the format. And, that's, again, sometimes decks that are 4th or 5th best do win the tournament, right? Just because it won doesn't mean that it's the best deck. I do think Giratina Darkrai is really good, but inherently in the format right now with all of the Buzzwole going around, all of the Charizard going around, all of the Oricorio still going around, I just can't really justify putting it any higher than like a middle to high A tier. So that's where Giratina goes. I think that Buzzwole is broken. So Buzzwole with Pheromosa, which is in my mind the lesser of the 2 options, is like at the top of A tier, and then the better Buzzwole version in my mind goes S tier. Also, it's better in the head-to-head. I think Kartana is just a little bit better. Silvally Rampardos, didn't do that good at Ursa Days, but is sort of the the generational kind of new pub stomper. It just kind of beats all of the bad decks, and it kind of filters everything out. So if you're gonna want to play a meta deck, if you're gonna want to compete in like high Master Ball tier, you have to play something that's either also like in A tier or above. Everything in B tier or below, you're probably gonna struggle with in Master Ball rank because a lot of these decks are just going to get beat by Silvally, or they might have a chance if they're specifically really good against a deck that's seeing a lot of play at that particular moment. Or Oricorio, I kind of feel that way. Yeah, it's definitely keeping a lot of decks in check. That's what Silvally Rampardos is doing. It's gatekeeping, and that's what this deck does. I don't think it's the best deck of the format. I think Buzzwole is the best deck. And then we have Solgaleo, which is I think our generational high roll deck. I think that this thing is just insane. It's a solitaire deck. You're either going to win or you're not going to win, depending on if you draw your cards. And yeah, so if you wanted to play a deck that was really simple, but, was unbeatable in a lot of different scenarios, that's kind of the deck for you, I think, honestly. Everything in A tier is really, really good, whether it's Buzzwole, whether it's Giratina Darkrai, Charizard Silvally, Dark Arceus, Guzzlord, or even Silvally Oricorio. I think these are all really, really good decks. I would not be shocked if any of these decks ended up winning in Ursa Days tournament. These are decks that you could still certainly play in high rank to get to Master Ball efficiently, or even climb up the ranks in Master Ball. I think all of these decks in A tier are really, really good. The difference between S tier and A tier is pretty minimal. I say that every week, but it really is. So that's why these decks are A tier. I just think that they're like a slight smidgen below S tier, or they're just not seeing enough play to justify S tier, but they are also really good. So anything that's A tier and above, I think, is a really good choice in the format. B tier is where we kind of drop off a little bit. These are decks that have really good potential, that are either inherently strong decks that aren't really well positioned, or are inherently not very strong decks that are particularly well positioned, right? They're just not both at the same time. So that's why they go into the B tier. These are decks that I would be surprised if we saw any of these decks win Ursa Days. I would be a bit surprised. I'm not saying it can happen. I just don't really think that it will happen. I would be pretty shocked to see. C tier, these are decks that are just not good. I think that, they're still seeing a bit of play. There is a bit of a reason to play them. They may be inherently pretty decent, but just really not well positioned, or vice versa. And yeah, so that's where kind of the C tier goes for me. And then D tier, these are decks that I would tell you to not play. Generationally, just straight up. These are decks that might fall off of the tier list. These are decks that you should not be playing. They go right there into the D tier. And that's the tier list this week, guys. Comment below. Let me know what you guys think. I would love to hear your guys' opinions. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay tuned. More content coming on the channel in the upcoming days. I'm really, really excited. I actually have quite a bit of fun in this format, mainly because I'm a Buzzwole player, and I think Buzzwole is really, really fun. We did live stream on Sunday night, and I think we had a pretty great time. Master Ball's been pretty fun with me playing Buzzwole, or fun for me playing Buzzwole. But I think a lot of the other decks are pretty enjoyable as well. So, yeah, guys, I would love to hear your opinions down in the comment section, so go ahead and let me know. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay tuned. All right, guys, peace out. Have a good one, and we'll see you guys later. It's a long one this week. Hour and 5 minutes. All right, bye.